All right, this is the first of the mini lectures for Module 2. And in Module 2, we're going to be looking at human population geography, also known as demography. What we're interested in here is how and why human populations are distributed across space, and then how they change through time and through space. So, again, in the module, what we're going to be talking about is human population by the numbers, why we study demography. In other words, that is, where do we apply these numbers and our information to? We're going to look at measures of human population, that is, absolute size of a population, as well as density. And remember, the density from last module is a normalization. In other words, how do we compare things across space? You're then going to be talking about the demographic equation, as well as the demographic transition, which is how we understand growth and decline of populations. All right, so many of you may have seen this guy in a very famous movie. And in the movie, again, the universe is finite, its resources are finite. If life is left unchecked, life will simply cease to exist. Well, the idea behind this in the movie was that there was concern that humans and all life simply grew too much and too fast for their resources. Well, this has been a theme for a considerable period of time. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich published a book called The Population Bomb. And again, if you look at the heading underneath the title, while you are reading these words, 4 people will have died from starvation, most of them children. The question that is asked is, can our resources support the population that is growing? And in the 1960s, this was a real concern. In fact, there was some very famous movies presented. For example, this is one called Soylent Green, and I'm just going to very briefly play the beginning of it.
New York City, in the year 2022. Nothing runs anymore. Nothing works. But the people are the same. And the people will do anything to get what they need. This is the police. What they need most is Soylent Green. The supply of Soylent Green has been exhausted.
Now, of course, you can watch the entire movie, but what I wanted to point out at the very beginning of this is that this is literally next year. Now, this was made many, many years ago, but the idea behind it was that there was an absolute concern after Paul Ehrlich's book that at some point in our future, the population would simply outstrip the resources. And you notice that the fear was complete societal collapse. Well, again, this is not a new idea. Thomas Malthus in the late 1700s, in fact, came up with a similar question. And his argument was essentially that population grows exponentially. Another term for that sometimes is geometrically, while resource production grows only arithmetically. In other words, farming adds an acre, 1 acre, 2 acre, 3 acre, 4 acre, 5 acre. People, however, a family has 2 children. Those 2 children each have 2 children. That means 4 children. Those 4 children now each have 4 children, 16, 4 times. And you can see this rapid exponential growth of population. And what Malthus said is that at some point we would reach a crisis. And that crisis point, according to Malthus, would lead to famine, war over resources, societal and economic and environmental collapse. So, again, if we look at these, it doesn't sound terribly different than what we saw in, if you will, the popular movies of our era. Population, when unchecked, increases at a geometric ratio. Subsistence increases only at an arithmetic ratio. A slight acquaintance with numbers will show the immensity of the first power in comparison to the second. Now, here's where this gets really ugly, and this is not inconsistent, again, with today's thinking. What Malthus, the first piece, makes some sense, but what he said next is incredibly disturbing. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people in houses, and count and court the return of the plague. What Malthus was literally saying is keep the poor poor so that they die. And again, an incredibly disturbing idea, but this is where population and population control often leads to is a also an economic and social conflict. And so we have to be very careful when we look at population data that we don't embed in it class, race, economic, socioeconomic factors, and if you will, the haves and the have nots, the rights and the wrongs of it. So we have to be careful about that. All right, so what we're going to do next is look a little bit at population by the numbers. And I just want to very briefly, again, this link will be on our D2L site, and it's often worth looking at this and watching what happens. This is the US and the world population clock. And so again, for your notes, it's worth understanding that, again, approximately 332 million people in the United States and 7.7 billion people in the world. Now, if you notice over here, this is roughly the rate at which the world population is growing. As I'm talking, you can see we're at 7,763,384,000, and I can't even keep up with the birth rate here. In the United States, if you look at this, one of the things that we're going to see is this rate. So in other words, one birth every 8 seconds, one death every 12 seconds. So our births are still outpacing our deaths. These two are counterbalancing each other. And then our international migration, about one net per 670 seconds. And so we gain a person, the United States gains a person every 29 seconds. Okay. Now, later on, we're going to be looking at some other ways of seeing this population, but this is the population by the numbers. So, human population dynamics, what we're interested in here is the idea of you as a demographic element. And within that, what we're interested in from a demographic standpoint, what demographers are interested in, is first the biological component, the physical traits of the individual. Obviously, males versus females, we're interested in that because of who can reproduce. We're also interested in age. What percent of the population is within a reproductive age standpoint? And then race and ethnicity, many times we're interested in that in terms of diversity, also the distribution of different groups across a landscape. Socioeconomic traits, also very important. We're interested in educational attainment, variations in income and employment associated with a population, housing characteristics, ownership versus rental versus unoccupied, and then how people move. And so we're going to be thinking a little bit about how you fit into all of this. Okay, so why do we study this? Well, quite simply, human population helps us, understanding demographics helps us to understand policy, planning, epidemiology, economics, and marketing. And in our next lecture, we're going to get at each one of these. So we'll see you in mini lecture 2.